So, what I tend to find to be really important with client retention is I tend to not necessarily think about it as retention. I tend to think about it as trying to create a client journey and a plan. I talk about it as a plan all the time. And the thing about a plan is that for you to communicate that plan, you need to know exactly what those steps look like and you need to communicate to them. Because at the end of the day, they're coming into you with a problem and you're there to try and help them solve that problem. So very much what we were talking about yesterday in terms of, understanding the client, getting to know them, knowing why they're here. One of the big things that I think about is that the reason that they've showed up is usually pain or injury, yeah? Now, what I always find interesting is that someone might have pain for 6 months and then all of a sudden they come into you and they say, I've had heel pain for 6 months. And the reality is that what I believe is that it's not necessarily the pain that brings them in, it's what it's stopping them from doing. And the only way that you'll get through into that and really feel like they're heard is if you try and explore that. And so in the initial, it's asking the questions about, all of your normal history, but really getting to the bottom of what is this stopping you from doing? What is the pain stopping you from doing? What are you fearful that is stopping you from doing? Because if you can communicate that, then they know that you know. And I think that's important because you're not only trying to understand the problem, you're also trying to understand them because they need to feel trusted and those sort of things, right? So when we're looking at them being here, this is where pain and injury is. You're trying to get them to here, right? Now, everyone thinks, and especially them, that this is pain-free. That's what they think they're working towards. But this is really hard to objectify, as you'd know, right? So you can't, to set that as a goal can be really challenging. And so there needs to be things along the way to know that they're moving in this right direction towards pain-free. And what we're here to do is we're here to unpack it and build a bit of some options for them. And so let's say we're talking about plantar fascia, right? In an ideal world, you might have someone better in 12 weeks. So this timeline's 12 weeks, okay? Now let's say you get them at week 1, which would be awesome. You've then got 12 weeks to try and get them there. If you're in their shoes, right? So you're training, you're active and those sort of things. If you have back pain that puts you out from training for 12 weeks, you'd understand the feelings of, I feel depressed and I feel anxious and I really like to exercise, so important to me. If I said, Steph, this is probably going to get better in 12 weeks if we did nothing, so just do nothing until that point, what would you say?
12 weeks, isn't it?
12 weeks. What is another option that someone might say? Let's pretend here. If I said, don't do anything for 12 weeks, we'll just wait till it goes away.
Yeah, it's 12 weeks.
Yeah.
Can't do it in 12, not.
Okay, what if they said that's not an option for me? You'd be like, okay, we need to work out some options here to get going, because at the end of the day, having something off for 12 weeks, there's rarely an injury that's going to cause that, right? So let's talk about plantar fascia. We've got plantar fascia, we've got a runner, yeah? And they're running 60 Ks a week. So it's important to them, okay? So if I said to the runner, you've got plantar fascia pain, you need 12 weeks off, I'll see you here, then usually they're like, there might be another option here, I'm going to go and find another opinion, okay? Or we say, let's build a plan that's going to help you through this 12-week period. I am here to help you get you through, okay? And we provide some options, right? So what we know works for plantar fascia pain is taping at a starting point, education, really good, plantar fascia stretching and rolling and these sort of things. That's your top line treatment, and everything else comes under here, okay? So we might say, right, we're going to trial some taping for the first week. The tape might stay on for 3 and 4 days. And so the check-in could be after the taping or 1 week. That's your first check-in, okay? Now, it's not that you're not only testing to see if the taping's helped, you're also checking to see how much this has landed with them. Because what you say in this first consult, probably 90% is going to get forgotten, right? And so it's a check-in to say, right, how did everything sit after the first consult? And they'll be like, you know what I found really interesting was that, I can appreciate why my morning pain hurts now because there's more water in the tendon in the fascia in the morning. And so it's like, okay, that's really great. And they might say, I've got another question. And usually what it is that the more questions and the better understanding they have in it, the more in control they feel of their symptoms, right? Now, if we said, let's tape you up, that's going to last 3 days, and see you here 4 weeks. And so they've now got 4 weeks worth of questions to say, I'm not really sure what's here. They Googled it, they're not sure. All of a sudden they're like, oh, am I going to need surgery? And there's symptoms that are worsening. Because what we also know is that if we have a look at pain, it's going to do this. Yeah, slow and steady as we go. And if someone's hitting at a peak and they've peaked 3 or 4 times, and you haven't seen them through those peaks, they can really lose track and control of what's going on, right? So that's not also what you're here for, is you jump into this education point and slowly drip feed them the information as they go. And so it might be like, okay, you've got someone moving through a 12-week progression of plantar heel pain as a runner. You might say, hey, you're actually progressing really well at week 4. Let's re-enter you into a running plan here. How happy do you think they'd be if they get into running here as opposed to 8 weeks later? Incredibly happy, okay? So it's this ability to zoom out and say, right, what does this actual treatment plan look like and how can we intervene and change as we go through? Yeah? And trying to communicate that to the person. Now, how you communicate that will depend on the person. It doesn't need that you need to fully draw out a plan to get them there, but it's the ability to say, right, what's the worst case scenario here? We see you in a week and you have the same amount of symptoms and they come back and like, yep, look, we had a little increase in the tape, that's positive, we might intervene with an orthotic, or we might intervene with some continual taping, or I will teach you how to do it yourself, so that again, you're providing them with the steps that they need to go, okay? Because I can guarantee you, if you see someone at week 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, that's 6 chances for you to have 6 education sessions to try and influence how they're thinking about it, which is yesterday, it was, what are the stresses like? Do we need to address sleep? Do we need to address these sort of things? And usually what I find is when people lose touch with not potentially coming back in, it's because they were unclear as to what next step they need to take. And so usually after I'll have a consultation with someone, the thing I'll send through is what's the plan? What are your exercise rehabs? And what is your plan for your next appointment? So that they know what they're coming in for at the next appointment. But in order for you to do that, you need to know what that plan is. Yeah, and again, you've got enough experience to plan out what that looks like. So if we were to say, right, what does session 1 look like? Right, so we'll look at session 1 and we'd say, right, let's tape, let's educate to the level that they need, yeah? So, this is going to get better. This is what we need to do to try and improve this. This is what the diagnosis is. This is what your fascia function is, etc. Give them something to work on. Heat bag, calf raise. Find the deficit that you're like, hey, look at the left versus right. You can see there's work here to do, yeah? And like, oh yeah, my left calf it's blowing up, okay? So then session 2 comes around. Check in to see how the symptoms are. Hopefully they're like, yeah, I can feel like it's a little bit better. My mornings are heaps better, or I'm less sore through my calves, whatever it is. So it's like, okay, we might then say, right, let's tape again. This is a week later. Continue the education. Bring something back up. So, you're telling me your work was pretty stressful last time. How's the week been? Yeah, it's been better actually. Can you see how that correlates with your symptoms at all? Because it one shows that you've listened to them, and 2, it sort of begins to build in these other things that can impact on pain. Yeah. Then we're beginning to tap in the plan from the last appointment, which was, hey, we've gone from a double calf raise. Can we do a single today? Can we progress into the single calf raise? Because we know that in order for a fascia cell to adapt, we need appropriate load, we believe. And so that's what I'd be saying to someone. And I could say, right, The reality is that if you're not hopping with symptoms that are stable and less than 4 out of 10, we're potentially not ready to run yet. And so in order to get to that stage, we need to have you single leg calf raising, we need to have you double hopping, and then we need to have you single leg hopping, yeah? But they don't know that. That's what you're here for. And so it's like, that was a week later. They're feeling positive, they're feeling better. So then you might be, okay, let's teach you how to tape, if that's working well. That'll hit a plateau anyway, in terms of its effectiveness. When do you want to catch up next? Is a common question I say. And they'll say, well, when do you reckon? I say, well, depending on how much of this work you need to do in the session and this, you might say, all right, let's push it to 2 weeks. You're going well. You need a bit of work hopping to try and get you into your single leg stuff. How does that sound? Good, let's go. Yeah, so you're consistently reinforcing the plan, but then you're also ensuring that that plan sits okay with them. And so it's consistently coming back to your overall thought of like, what does this 12-week plan look like? We need to get them loading in a double, we need to get them loading in a single, we need to introduce plyos and progress that all the way through, and ensuring that that's sitting okay with them. Now, if generally people are really good with this stuff because they know what's next, and any ambiguity comes is because we either don't know what's next or we're not feeling that it's valuable. And that's when the money comes into it. And it's always a tough conversation, but you know, if it's something that pops up, it needs to be addressed as soon as it's popped up. You know, like if you're like, you know, are you okay to catch up in a week's time? Or I'd like to see you in a week's time, is that possible? And they're like, yeah, we're sort of struggling a bit with work at the moment. Conversation straight away. Okay, is there some financial constraints here? And like, yeah, you know, we're battling. It's like, okay, what we'll do is, you know, I will give you the work, but I need you to complete the work. If I'm not seeing you as often, okay? And that's just something that, you know, you can work with, or you have a chat to Laura and you get some changes in conversation. And so if that's an issue, then hit that straight on, because the reality is that providing value and money needs to be separate. Because we don't choose how people spend their money in healthcare, you know? For example, I've got someone recently I've got a young AFL footballer, ankle injury, they wanted twice a week rehab for 14 weeks. It's what they wanted to do. We didn't need to do that in the end. You know, it was twice a week, once, every 2 weeks and things like that. But they valued the injury and him enough at that time that they were going to spend the money on that, okay? And we don't choose that, because this running might provide them the happiness which builds their relationship, which keeps them healthy, and they value that more than anything else, and they're happy to, you know, part with their money for that. So that's not something we choose in terms of what's the ideal number to treat. If you were like, oh, come in every 3 days and I'll tape you for 12 weeks, I'd be like, there's probably a better way to achieve this. But planning those things can be a bit of like, you know, do you want to come in next week, or when do you want to come in next? And there's also an argument to that, because if you went to a mechanic with something and the mechanic's like, oh, when do you want me to fix it? Or when do you think this needs to be done? You'd be like, I don't know, I'm paying you to do it. And that's where that team collaboration comes in to work together. So really keeping them in tune with that so that they feel in a bit of control can be really helpful, I believe, as well, as to like how often they need to come in. And you can see change with this stuff quite quickly. Like I used to think early days, like if I see anyone less than 2 weeks, nothing's going to change. Incorrect. Because we know that there's a central level of pain that's going to dictate what goes on. And they have questions, and you learn them more and you can teach them all the way through. So then you might say, we've hit our plateau with tape. We're now at week 3. We know that if someone gets a 2 out of 10 VAS improvement, then an orthotic might be helpful if they've utilised tape. So then you might intervene with an orthotic here, okay? So you've got a load management tool that you've included. There you go, good. You continue that education. You'll see here that usually the reason you see people a lot of times is to continually educate them, yeah? And then you can introduce your double hopping. So things are progressing. You might do a bit of physical treatment if you need to when you go through. And it's just this progression. They're like, oh, I can see where I'm going next. I can see where I'm moving towards. I'm trying to get into the single leg hop, because as soon as I can get there, we can look at a return to run, yeah? But if you're like, here, let's get you, as soon as you can single leg hop, they can run. They're just going to single leg hop all the time, and they haven't built the capacity to get themselves there. So that's what that journey will begin to look like, okay? Now, Does that make sense at a normal injury point? Yeah? Ankle sprains, acute ankle sprains, I could argue that you could see them twice a week for 3 weeks because you're trying to get their patterns better straight away because you know they can go on to be chronic. Now, when it comes to the MDC, what I found useful is when you've got a multidisciplinary clinic, they've had a massive day, right? So they've got surgeon, they've had a scan, there's so much information that's coming in and you're the last person that enters the room, okay? And so what I found effective with the MDC is that you're almost coming in and you're like, right, let's take a breath. The surgeon's just left. What does this next little bit look like? And it's usually like a bit of a calmer to try and bring everything together so that you're helping them formulate what the plan looks like, okay? So I tend to be a little bit of like, I'm here as a bit of a hand holder because you've just been through a lot of information. You know, if the surgeon's like, well, we're going to look at surgery, this is what it looks like, it's like, that's pretty big for people. And you know, I've looked at an x-ray and they might be trying to be like, oh, if there's arthritis somewhere else, what's going to happen? And so I usually come into this and say, right, I sit down, doctor does recommend surgery, how are you feeling? Yeah, it's pretty overwhelming, but I think I'm okay. It's like, okay, are there any big questions that we need to start with? And they're like, right, what does work look like? What does driving look like? All these big things that they're stressing about in their head that might impact on that, you can begin to talk through that with them. And then they're like, oh no, I'm feeling pretty good. It's like, okay, let's have a bit of a chat about what I tend to see post-surgery and how potentially we might be able to help you post-surgery. Is that okay? Yes. And so what you'll notice a little bit is that you're consistently asking for permission because you're reinforcing what they're saying. Is that okay? Does that make sense? Is that helpful? All the way through, no matter the part of the conversation. And so with MDC, when Dr. Dares might be like, right, this is more of a conservative management, I need you to take over here. You can come in, ask the same questions, right, you've been through a lot today, how is this all sitting with you? This is an Achilles tendinopathy. This is usually how we progress Achilles tendinopathy based on where you're at. And it might be, okay, Dr. Dares has recommended shockwave. What is shockwave therapy? This. The research recommends we need between 3 and 5 treatments to get a positive outcome. Usually a week apart is a really good time to utilise that. Have you had shockwave before? Yes, no. What is shockwave? And it's really trying to, at that lowest form, given that the amount of information that they've come into the day, apply the plan, give them confidence, let them know what's next. What's really challenging for people after the MDC is this word. Maybe. Yeah? The thing about the MDCs is there's so many options and people usually get overwhelmed. We've got shockwave, we've got orthotics, we've got surgery, we've got mobilisation, we've got needling. They're all like, well, I don't know. It's like, you know, going to the mechanic and you've got a gearbox issue and they're like, right, how do you want to fix this? And you're like, what do you think? You know, it's to provide this direction. Well, it's pretty chronic, let's potentially start with shockwave. This is what it is, this is what's next. And so I think if you can just have a bit of that self-reflection and walk out of every session and think to yourself, do they know what's next? Have I made myself clear? Then following up the question to the person, how does that plan sound? Because they should literally be able to know, right, if I go to the front desk right now, my next choice is that I need to book in with Stefan because we're doing shockwave. Or I need to book in with Laura because we need a further assessment up the chain because there's some hip action here. Or this needs 5 sessions of rehab with Caitlin. Like, you're there to almost add that little bit of consultative role. Sometimes it's like, we need treatment right now. We need to put a metdome in right now. We need to do something right now. And again, what I tend to find is with the MDC, it's pretty overwhelming. And so if we're coming in and you're providing more options and we're like, you can try this, you can try this, you can try this, you can try this, they're like, I think I need you to tell me what's next. I need you to be like, right, let's try a metdome. If that's not potentially good, we can go down the path of a custom orthotic. If that's not good, then this is where it's at. So it's a little bit of the indecisiveness that we can have as practitioners when it's not necessarily indecisiveness, it's more that we are providing them with the options and then as the client they can begin to choose, but sometimes you need to hold their hand, you know? And a little bit of the difference which you might be noticing with public versus private is that you have the ability to fully help them along whatever journey they want to take. because if it needs to be a custom orthotic or it needs to be a shockwave and you know that they're going to get benefit from sessions and you've got availability, then deliver, you know? And so it's usually not the fact that it's not that they don't think that you know what you're doing, it's they want to know that you know how it's impacting them, which is all the stuff we went through in terms of understanding their social setting and understanding why they're hurting, understand what's stopping them from doing. But it's also then being able to clearly dictate what the plan looks like, because then they're like, sweet, all right, I know what's next. And if that doesn't work, then I know some other options that are out there, but we're going to start with this. Because if they go home and their husband or partner says what they say, they're usually like, oh my God, they said so much. And if they go home and their partner's like, what they say? You're like, well, they said this, this, this. And like, okay, so what do you got to do? And they're like, well, I can do this, or I can do this, or I can do this. And they're like, okay, well, what are you going to do? And they're like, well, I don't know. And so then the chance of them picking up the phone and ringing the reception saying, I don't really know what to do, is really low, because people need a next step. We all do. So if you're like, right, here's everything that's gone on today. The best options are shockwave, exercise, and this. I think we start with this. We can address this at a later point. What do you think? And they're like, I can't really afford 5 sessions. You're like, okay, well, why don't we start with a session of shockwave and I can give you some exercise rehab to work on. How does that sound? That sounds really good. Okay, so it's like, here's the next step and that's what it looks like. But then it's also that there's other options there if it's not going to be beneficial for them. Does that make sense? Yeah? But that's fine. It's usually that if they've gotten to the point where they've rebooked with you as a podiatrist, but then they cancel, then it's either they're either not sure of it. Yes, there can be money involvement, but it's about trying to create that value that you're like, right, this session is going to be a big, valuable session. Very clear of what's next, very clear of how we think that it might help you, and then they can make that decision, because it builds that authority figure that you are in the room. Because at the end of the day, what we're doing is you're leading in the room. That's all you're doing, is you're leading them. And that's usually what I tend to find, is that the maturity of a practitioner is how well they can lead in the room. And that comes from experience, because they know it's going to be helpful. It comes from the maturity of being a person, because you can have these tougher conversations and help with that leading. But then it's also backing yourself and really giving them the direction of where they need to go. So that's what it is. It's leadership in the room. And yeah, I totally agree that the public can be really challenging for that, but there's still opportunity to hone in those skills. Because if you're like, right, again, they're overloaded with information, they're not going to retain much of what I've said here. What's going to be the biggest bang for buck thing that they can do to improve it? Right, for you it's shoes. Let's do it. Here's some shoe education. Go hard on it. And then they might say, cool, so do you think that I'll need an orthotic or something? And you can say, yeah, well, it could be beneficial. Get your shoes first, then we can do a follow-up and we can have a conversation about orthotics. Because otherwise it's just all through the head, it's too much information, okay? Does that help a little bit? Yeah. So just keep thinking to yourself, what's next? I know you know what's next, but they have no idea. That's what you've got to presume, is you've got to presume that they don't know what's next and you're really going to hold their hand to try and guide them through, no matter the injury, no matter the problem. Cool? Awesome.